But yeah, anyway, this is on Wittgenstein's notion of a surveyable representation, rituals, aesthetics, and aspect perception, forthcoming in AJP, the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. So yeah, so if anyone has any ideas about that, let me know. But like, it's this is gonna be coming. Of course, I'm gonna have to actually get some good emotes. So that'll be the biggest hurdle here. Anyway, so we'll have an emote review. Consider the following two puzzling views that Wittgenstein advances in his remark on Fraser's golden bow. First, he seems to argue that knowledge of the origins of a ritual is irrelevant to appreciating its meaning. Second, he argues that the meaning of a given ritual is both part of the ritual itself and describing one's own feelings and thoughts. Both of these views require an explanation, since it seems that the meaning of most rituals can only be elucidated by reference to their origins, so that the question of what a ritual means cannot entirely be segregated, you're missing a B right there, from its development, and B, it is not clear how we should reconcile the fact that the meaning of a given ritual is both dependent on and independent of spectators, especially given Wittgenstein's talk of perceiving internal relations and formal connections in his discussion of Fraser. My point of entry is Moore's observation that Wittgenstein's discussion of aesthetics was mingled in a curious way with criticism of assumptions which he said were constantly made by Fraser in The Golden Bow. A thread running through these remarks is the distinction between hypothetical explanations and a synopsis of the facts, suggestive of a view according to which the value of both projects lies in a certain type of synopsis that they provide the facts in question. My aim in this paper is to demonstrate that analogies, both explicit and implicit, between Wittgenstein's discussion of rituals, aesthetics, and aspect perception have important payoffs in terms of understanding his notion of a surveyable representation. Perhaps most well known from Wittgenstein's metaphilosophy, where its subject matter is grammatical, as it applies to phenomena that are not exclusively grammatical in nature. In particular, I will argue that a surveyable representation of certain anthropological and aesthetic facts allow us to see, qua form of aspect perception, internal relations and formal connections, so that the inner nature of a ritual or the solution of an aesthetic puzzle is exhibited. This particular form of seeing both explains why Wittgenstein thought that hypothetical explanations about the origins of a ritual are irrelevant to appreciating its meaning, and elucidates his understanding of rituals, which involves seeing internal relations and formal connections. Regarding the former, I will argue that Wittgenstein's concern is not only methodological, a matter of where one looks in examining the phenomena, but also epistemological, a concern with a kind of seeing versus a kind of interpreting. A distinction brought out by attention to Wittgenstein's remark on aspect perception. I conclude by briefly discussing the upshots of the account for work in anthropology. Alright, first of all, this person makes very big sentences with very big words. I don't like that for reading it, but like, okay. Anything else to be said right here? Yeah, it's, you're gonna have to know something of Wittgenstein, I think, to understand this, which is fine. This isn't a, academic journal paper on Wittgenstein, but still, this is not going to be easily accessible for people who have no understanding of this. So if anyone has questions out there, let me know. I know something of Wittgenstein. If you notice, like in the pop-ups here, this Wittgenstein's wager, like below, I mean, I've published on the topic. From philosophical methodology to rituals. The notion of a surveyable representation is central to Wittgenstein's philosophical methodology, which is most succinctly summarized in Philosophical Investigations. Quote, our considerations must not be scientific ones, and we may not advance... where is this? 109, okay. And we may not advance any kind of theory. There must not be anything hypothetical in our considerations. All explanation must disappear, and description alone must take its place. And this description gets its light, that is to say, its purpose, from the philosophical problems. These are, of course, not empirical problems, but they are solved through an insight into the workings of our language, and that, in such a way, these workings are recognized, despite an urge to misunderstand them. The problems are solved not by coming up with new discoveries, but by assembling what we have long been familiar with. I mean, where's surveyable representation here? I don't know. Okay. Philosophical investigations, which are grammatical or conceptual, do not make use of hypothetical explanations in order to solve empirical problems, because philosophy just puts everything before us neither explains nor deduces anything. I mean, you can see immediately the idea that everything's already laid out for you. That is an assumption about stuff. Like, you don't actually have to do work. Philosophy just puts everything before us. Really? I mean, there's no work to be done there? Yeah. I mean, then there's a dash. This is all Wittgenstein, I think, related quotes. Since everything lies open to view, there is nothing to explain. This methodology, and that's the end of it. That was a direct quote. I mean, the idea that, like, everything's right there, I think that's a little bit fast, even for Wittgenstein. I think he also didn't always say that, because as he gets into the aspect viewing, you have to do things to look at certain things the right way. It lies open to view. It's like, yes, what is this metaphor of openness? I mean, not everything's so open. You know, sometimes you do have to do some digging. This methodology has both a positive and a negative aspect. On the positive side, Wittgenstein argued that the task of philosophy is to clarify the use of our language. On the negative side, instead of trying to solve the problems of philosophy, the methodology sheds light on our problems by clearing misunderstandings away, primary misunderstanding concerning the use of words, of our words. When this happens, philosophical problems dissipate of themselves. Indeed, the negative and positive tasks of Wittgenstein's philosophical method are intertwined, for aiming at complete clarity simply means that the philosophical problems should completely disappear. This clarity is attained via a surveyable representation. A main source of our failure to understand is that we don't have an overview of the use of our words. Our grammar is deficient in its surveyability. A surveyable representation produces precisely that kind of understanding which consists in seeing connections. Hence the importance of finding and inventing intermediate links. The concept of a surveyable representation is of fundamental significance for us. It characterizes the way we represent things, how we look at matters. Is this a Weltanschauung? You see, here's the thing. In his earlier work, he said, that which we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. So this deficiency in surveyability, something you can't speak about because you are deficient in this area, seems like something you want to pass over in silence. Here he's saying, well, maybe there's a way to talk about it. Or is he? Like, what is the interpretation of this passage? Is he... The problem with one of the problems with interpreting Wittgenstein is sometimes he writes stuff and then he goes on and criticizes it. So if you just were to read the section, like 122 here, the question is, was he setting this up as a failure, or was he setting this up as a positive thing to do? Especially given his earlier views that if you can't talk about it, something that your language cannot do, your grammar is deficient. Like, our grammar is deficient. And then in surveyability. So, like, that's the thing. Is it something we can't do? Or is it just a weakness of our grammar? I don't know exactly what this means here. But, like, this is, like, in terms of Wittgensteinian stuff, this is, like, a big topic for him. So, the author here giving this viewpoint, like, that may be the correct one, I don't know. Alright, author says, a surveyable representation helps us to understand the essence of language construed as something that already lies open to view and not as something that lies beneath the surface, which becomes surveyable through a process of ordering. More specifically, it helps us to establish an order in our knowledge and the use of language by emphasizing distinctions which our ordinary forms of language easily make us overlook. Interpretations vary regarding the workings of a surveyable representation according to a bird's eye view model. See, this is the weird thing. A bird's eye view model. Like, is that really what Wittgenstein, you're saying Wittgenstein is doing here? Because you can't get outside of your language, and that was a big thing in the Tractatus, the earlier Wittgenstein, his earlier work. So according to a bird's eye view model, such a representation is a presentation or arrangement of grammatical rules which can be taken in as a whole, much in the same way that one can attain a bird's eye view of a city by looking down at it from a height. According to the more recent and modest neglected aspects model, a surveyable representation merely brings hitherto unnoticed aspects of things to a person's awareness, that is, it gets him to see things differently. See, this is odd. You don't need a bird's eye view to bring hitherto unnoticed aspects of a thing's awareness to get it to see you differently, to see things differently. You don't need a bird's eye view. You need, like, sort of like a different view. But a bird's eye view model definitely gives you a perspective on stuff that you otherwise wouldn't have, because, that's why it's the bird's eye view. It's not a human's eye view. It's like above. Now, we like this metaphor of looking down from above to see the whole thing. But of course, you can't see what's like covered. Like, you don't see what's under a tree from the bird's eye view model. You don't see what's in a house from the bird's eye view model. But this Baker thing, I don't know what this is. Yeah, we'll have to see. Baker notes that a surveyable representation can have non-grammatical subject matter, such as the morphology of plants, the classification of animals, religious ceremonies, or magical rites, and so it is not a pleonasm to speak of a surveyable representation of grammar. The most detailed discussion of a surveyable representation is not of grammar, occurs in the Remarks on Fraser's Golden Bow. In these remarks, Wittgenstein argues that the very idea of wanting to explain a practice seems wrong, and criticizes Fraser's attempt at providing causal hypothetical explanations about the origins of practices, arguing that the impression that a practice has on us is not due to a hypothesis about its origins. In place of the explanation, what we are really interested in is a description. One must only correctly piece together what one knows without adding anything, and the satisfaction of being sought through the explanation follows of itself. Here one can describe and say, this is what human life is like. Alright, so the more I'm thinking about this as I'm talking, I'm thinking I might agree in part with the author here. No one just does ritual for the ritual of doing ritual. Like, that would just be an empty ritual. Why would you keep doing it if you just, if it was just a historical thing? Like, why just keep doing something if it really isn't adding anything to your life? Rituals do not maintain themselves if there is nothing else that they are tied into. So, like, a ritual will die out. Why would someone keep making sacrifices to the blood god if every year, the blood god doesn't produce? It just doesn't seem like something. CJ, what's up? How you doing? Yeah, daytime stream. What's going on, CJ? Yeah, I'm thinking I might do more daytime Sunday streams. So, as opposed to waiting tonight. I found that, what was happening is I was I wanted to do something fun during the day, and then I wouldn't get anything done at night because I was like, I gotta stream. So I was like, maybe let me get some streaming done a little earlier. You gonna vote? Oh, I gotta go vote. Yeah, I do have to vote. I have not done that yet. I did see your Discord post. I gotta go get on that, though. I've just been one too many things recently. People have started asking me for stuff, and I'm like, I would like to help out. It's like, yeah, but now my stack of things to do is getting higher, and my time is getting less. So, yeah. But I hope you're doing well. Yeah, good. You're doing well. I just, and I gotta get back to working on Minesweeper. It's just like, all of a sudden, everything's stacking up, and I gotta go make some more money, too. So it's like, what are you gonna do? Trying to keep stuff going. But yeah, that's cool. But thanks for stopping by. We're reading this paper on Wittgenstein. Remember, send a screenshot in the music channel in your Discord. I will do it. Yeah, I see. I got a new mouse so I could play. I got a gaming mouse so I can play Minesweeper. That was what was it, birthday? Well, some present in the last year. I asked for a gaming mouse so I could play more Minesweeper, and I just have not got around to it. And I have a very fancy mouse now. It's like, oh, dag nabbit, why can't I even have a mouse and I can't play? Yeah, this is one of the things, I want to play Minesweeper. And it's funny, because I sit around, I got Twitch open in one screen, and then I'm, doing stuff in another screen. People talking about games, I'm like, man, all these other games sound so good, but I just want to go play some more Minesweeper. That's nice. Talking about, Dark Souls and stuff, and, all the intricacies of Dark Souls games. I'm like, I like Minesweeper. I want to play Minesweeper. Yeah, so. But yeah. And bringing everything back together. The question of why do you do things over and over and over when they don't seem to have any sort of history to them? It's you play Minesweeper because it's fun. You do ritual because there's something inherent to the ritual that brings something to your life. Well, same. I talk about a new game I play it with a friend and I've heard it's boring. I'm like, I play Minesweeper. Yeah, it doesn't matter exactly. That's not the reason. Oh, the game is boring. It's not. That's not the reason. Yeah, repetitive. Well, that's why I think I like the Dark Souls content. It's very repetitive. You die, you play, you die, you play, you die. It's a very difficult game. It's kind of like Minesweeper. You're doing something very similar over and over, and you're memorizing patterns. It's a very similar game loop. And so, like, that sort of content is actually not so different. But like all roguelikes, and I think that's why like you and me, and I know Jovi, we all like roguelikes, like Hades, like Diablo 2, games like that. It's a very similar game loop. And so it's like you play, you die, you play, you die, and you do it again and again. And it's slightly different every time, but like we like this sort of thing. So again, like if you're talking about rituals, things you do over and over and over, why does that matter? And this is the thing, where it doesn't matter where they came from. And I think that's the point in this essay, is that if you're doing things over and over, does it matter where the game Hades came from? Does it matter where Dark Souls, like the history behind Dark Souls? That doesn't matter at all. Like, who cares who invented Minesweeper and what they were thinking? They invented Minesweeper. No. The game everyone plays for Minesweeper was invented because they wanted to teach people how to right-click. They wanted left and right-click. That is like the exact reason it was added to Windows in the 90s, to teach people mouse usage. That is the exact reason. Like, that is the only reason they did it there, because they wanted people to learn that you could use both fingers, and they had different meanings when you clicked left and right, and that like you could do this, and that was the point. The idea that like the left and right click has anything to do with playing Minesweeper now is like nonsense. But like I think that's exactly what the whole point of this paper is, and we're on page 4 of 23. But like we're gonna get there. Yeah. And so history doesn't matter. The fact that it's boring doesn't, like people think it's boring doesn't matter. It's like, why are you going to go pray for 10 hours a day? Some people do that. They don't do it because it's boring. They know it's boring. There are other benefits to it. Like, this is like not the obvious answer, like everyone knows it. So yeah, rant over. Okay. But like, this is why I think this is this quote right here, it's starting to get there. Here one can describe and say this is what human life is like. Now, human life is not to say it's boring, but like it has some aspect of what we do in it. And that is why we do it, because we get an experience of like what it is like to be alive in this sort of repetitive thing, but there's more to it than that. So, there's patterns, there's moving fast, there's figuring stuff out. Yeah, so this methodology, continuing, yeah, thanks for stopping by, CJ, but and feel free to ask questions or whatever, but here we go. This methodology allows one to see the data. Yeah, now I want to stream Minesweeper more too. I'm just like really grumpy. I have not had like the brain space to do anything in the last bit. It's just been unfortunate, but too many things going on. This methodology allows one to see the data in their relations to one another and to embrace them in a general picture without putting it in the form. Lurk. Good luck. Okay, yeah, definitely. Oh, new job? New job? You drop that now and then you lurk? Oh my god. Are you still working for the same people? I mean, the same company? Or are you going someplace else? Okay, but alright. You don't have to answer. We can discuss on Discord if you want to tell. Keep it off the internet at the moment. But alrighty. Yeah, have a good lurk. Hunter JK9 says, when he says what one knows, is that referring to objective data or one's own certainty in their belief? Okay, you're gonna make it public later. Yeah, I don't want to spoil your announcement. Absolutely. Hunter, I don't know yet. At the moment, let's see. One must only correctly piece together what one knows without adding anything, and the satisfaction of being sought through the explanation follows of itself. Okay, this is. I think what this means is you're supposed to be describing the world. See, that's what the point of the describe here is in the emphasized. It's italicized. You're not supposed to be adding anything. So it's not in some sense data. It's the immediacy of the world. So like you could call that objective data, but really you're talking about an objective description. Like, this is exactly how I see the world. Now, are you going to call that data? Yeah, you could, but it's not really certainty in your belief, but it's like sort of you're certain because it's there. Yeah, direct observation. I think that's what's going on here. So one must only correctly piece together what one knows. So that's like the things you understand about the world without adding anything. So it's a correct, it's a very sort of direct observation, I think, and that's a good way to put it. Welcome in Hunter JK9. This is kind of what I do during my philosophy roulette things. I read some academic philosophy and discuss it. So it's like, that's why it's just chatting about a philosophy paper. So somewhere between the podcasty and a talk show and just chatting. And feel free to ask questions along the way about this or anything else. I don't care, but I will sometimes defer questions till later if I feel like it. Like, it's my show. I can do what I want. This methodology allows one to see their data in relation to one another and to embrace them in a general picture without putting it in a form of a hypothesis about temporal development. Yeah, see, this is the thing, direct observation. There's no causal thing in like temporal development. It's a static picture of how you see the world at that time. The general picture is a surveyable representation, as Wittgenstein asserts in a passage that served as the basis for Investigations section 122. Quote, "And so the chorus points to a secret law. One feels like," and that's a quote, "one feels like saying to Fraser's collection of facts, I can represent this law, this idea by means of an evolutionary hypothesis, or also analogously to the schema of a plant, by means of the schema of a religious ceremony, but also by means of the arrangement of its factual content alone, in a perspicuous surveyable representation." I can't read German. "The concept of a perspicuous representation is of fundamental importance for us. It denotes the form of our representation." Yeah, see, right here is what it is. The form of our representation, the way we see things. A kind of worldview. This perspicuous representation brings about the understanding which consists precisely in the fact that we see the connections, hence the importance of finding connecting links. So yeah, this is supposed to be a structured understanding of like our observations. That's what it is. Like, we're not giving a like how it came to be story. We're saying this is what is we're looking at, and it's giving a like logical structure between the different parts of what we see. Like in this, for real briefly, what you can do is like the paper's there, the description's below, but you understand there's a relation between me, the description, and the paper by the orientation on the page. And so there's something to that, and you can say that's not a causal history, that's not something in time, but there is a structure to even what you're seeing on Twitch right now. Okay. Hunter says, "So if you don't add anything, then the similarities you see will be more accurate and not contaminated by extra assumptions." I think that's the idea. Of course, we are fallible things and we will always be contaminating stuff, but I think the idea is that there's something very fundamental about like these like sort of form representations. Like if I say below and left, like, well, it's my, is that left? I'm pointing left, yeah, but like it's to my right on the screen. Then of course you're going to have associations between left and below in your head or my head, because that's what we do as humans. But like, I think the idea is that like, yeah, this is really the bare bones and not extra stuff. I don't know if we can escape that, but I think the idea is something there. Okay. Importantly, Wittgenstein notes that the connecting links do nothing more than direct our attention to similarity, relatedness of the facts, in the same way that one might illustrate an internal relation of a circle to an ellipse by gradually converting an ellipse into a circle. Yeah, and you can see, this is what I mean. We're modifying shapes here. So you got circles and like ellipses and stuff. So you got like round and like to like an oval. And so like the idea is that like by just showing that you can modify them simply, it's modifying like the internal relation of just like the squeeze or whatever on the circle. However, Wittgenstein continues, not in order to assert that a certain ellipse actually historically had originated from a circle, but only in order to sharpen our eye for a formal connection. Yeah. The history, I think, of some of the mathematics here is kind of interesting. The contemporary math relation between like circles, ellipses, and parabolas. I think there was a mathematician that was Hunter says, if the modification is a fact, then the relation is a fact. Yeah, and this is the thing, and that's what you're talking about. You're not talking about the history there. You're talking about that there is a relation that can be shown, and we just see it. And that's part of the thing. This is the Wittgenstein in the most phenomenological Wittgenstein that you can talk about, and that's why I want to read the paper, is because it's just in how you see it as you realize that there's a relation there. And the history of circles and ellipses and parabolas was actually a mathematician in jail It was in one of these repressive regimes. He got thrown in jail, but he had a flashlight, and he was in a dark cell with a flashlight. And what he would do is, let's see, do I have a prop? Okay. So you can imagine, like, my pen here is like you can see, is a flashlight. And what he was doing was shining the round light on the wall, and then he would, like, slowly turn it, and he realized he got to an ellipse, because when you see a round thing, like, oh, here's a quarter. When you see a round thing at an angle, it turns into an ellipse. And eventually, when you get the light off the wall, so you only saw half of it, that turns into a parabola, and he deduced the mathematical relations. Yeah, exactly, Hunter. And the mathematician deduced the mathematical relations in his head while sitting in a jail cell by considering these facts. Now, does that matter for the facts? No. That history is interesting in terms of, like, the stupid stuff people do to each other, but, like, exactly, it becomes a skewed oval, and then when it's a circle at the ground, and then if you slightly go off the wall, it becomes parabolic, or it looks something like that. And the mathematician figured it out. But, like, who cares about the historical thing about any particular circle? Was it an oval beforehand? So, yeah. But, like, this is what we're talking about here, I think. So, all right, the clearest example, and feel free to keep asking questions. This is great, like, when people ask, because, like, I'm going to get to try to work it out with you guys. The clearest example that Wittgenstein provides of the relevant facts and of what we see when using a surveyable representation of rituals occurs in his discussion of the Beltane Festival. This Gaelic fire festival, which lasted into the 18th century, was celebrated on May Day. During this festival, participants would perform fire-centered rituals, which were intended, among other things, to preserve their livestock and yield plentiful harvest. In one ritual, a pretended victim was seized and a show made of throwing him into the flames, and for some time afterwards, people affected to speak of him as dead, which, according to Fraser, is a mitigated survival of an older custom of actually burning people. Indeed, Fraser argues that the traces of human sacrifices at the Beltane fires were particularly clear and unequivocal. Wittgenstein, for his part, cautions that A, the meaning of the practice does not depend on its history being a certain way, for perhaps it was not like this at all, and B, even if we are provided with evidence regarding the prehistoric origins of the practice, it might be the case that nothing of the original meanings remains in the practice in its present-day form. Rather, he argues as follows regarding the practice's meaning. Excuse me. Quote, "The question is, does the sinister, as we may call it, attached to the practice of the Beltane Festival in itself, as it was carried on 100 years ago, or is the festival sinister only if the hypothesis of its origin turns out to be true? I believe it is clear the inner nature of the modern practice itself, which seems sinister to us, and the familiar facts of human sacrifice only indicate the lines along which we should view the practice. When I speak of the inner nature of the practice, I mean all circumstances under which it is carried out, and which are not included in a report of such a festival, since they consist not so much in specific actions which characterize the festival as in what one might call the spirit of the festival. Such things as would be included in one's description, for example, of the kind of people who partake in it, their behavior at other times, that is, their character, the kind of games which they otherwise play. And one would then see that the sinister quality lies in the character of these people themselves." Yes, the ritual is not sinister, it is the people who burn people who are sinister. It is a very common refrain. But again, it's like, yeah, there are multiple ways that things could have come about, like multiple realizability, evolution. Apparently the form of the crab has evolved at least 5 times, I believe. And so the idea that, like, you're looking and you say, oh, this is what the crab actually came from, it's not true. There are multiple times crabs have evolved in the exact same form, basically. And so the fact that you find a crab fossil, you don't know what it actually came from. It could have come from something you didn't expect because it has evolved multiple times. And so it's the same thing with what looks like a fire sacrifice may be really something else. We may just really like fire sacrifice festivals, not actually fire sacrifices. I don't know. Not an anthropologist. Okay. Continuing. As this discussion suggests, the fact of interest include the kind of people who take part in it, their behavior at other times, that is, their character, the kind of games which they otherwise play. Like we were just discussing Minesweeper. I play Minesweeper. Why do I play Minesweeper? Complicated. But like, what other things do I do? Like, is this a Sisyphusian thing, just clicking the buttons and dying and then restarting again? Well, what else are we doing on the computers? Moreover, when Wittgenstein discusses Goethe's idea of the primal plant as providing a synoptic presentation, he concludes by noting, in regards to his own philosophical project, we situate a linguistic form in its surroundings, we see the grammar of our language against a background of similar and related games. If we draw the analogy to Wittgenstein's discussion of Fraser, a given practice should be seen against a background of similar and related practices. What satisfies my puzzlement about Beltane is simply describing lots of things more or less like Beltane. When we see the relatedness of these facts, we perceive the inner nature of the modern practice itself, its meaning or meanings without reference to a hypothesis about its origins, or as Wittgenstein puts it eloquently elsewhere, a ritual can have its own complex of feelings without being connected with an ancient practice. Hunter asks, who constitutes the festival, what constitutes them, and what did they do? Makes sense. Yeah. So this is like, you can see that it's not such a clear thing that what looks like a historical thing is not necessarily historical when you try to find its meaning. A lot of times you can look at the history, but like that is only telling you in some sense about the people that did the thing. So the fact that these people did the thing, and maybe there are people that are like that, keep continuing to do it. But like, yeah, I think that's the thing. Like, who did it? Now, the people in the past or the people now, but why did these people like doing this sort of thing? Nevertheless, yeah, and like you can also look at the Twitch as always a very good example. I like using Twitch when I'm on Twitch, but like the idea is, where was that? What kind of games do they otherwise play? Go look at the communities that you're in on Twitch. And so it's like, what are these people doing and what is the chat like? And like, you can look at, why do you like this stuff? Like, why do you like those games? Why do you like this chat? Hunter says, history is really weird when you try to view it analytically or objectively. Yeah, and this is one of the things about 20th century philosophy, which we're discussing. Wittgenstein was a 20th century philosopher, is that it was looking ahistorically at a lot of stuff. And whether that's right or wrong, like, that doesn't matter right now, but it does do some very strange stuff when you're looking at it from this perspective, which says, don't look at the history, look at the people and what sort of things they did, look at their practices, and the practices can be done any old time. So it does look weird, but that doesn't mean, I mean, you're going to get something out of it. So, and like, people play old games. Why do people play old games? Well, old games still have something to offer us. What is that thing that they offer is the question. Like, history does, like, time and place matter, but sometimes there's other things to look at. Continuing. Nevertheless, two crucial questions remain unanswered. First, why would Wittgenstein insist that knowledge of the origins of a practice is not related to appreciating the inner nature of the practice? Indeed, it seems natural to assume that insofar as certain meanings are attached to a practice, causal hypothetical explanations about the origin of that practice would shed light on those meanings. But yeah, of course they could, but it could be a historical accident is what's going to happen. But like, the idea that like something came out of somewhere, that doesn't necessarily tell you why it's a good thing. It just means that's where it came from. Continuing. As Chaffee asks, can the question of what a ritual means be entirely segregated from an account of its development? Does the Mass, for example, have a meaning independent of how it developed? Aren't there aspects of most rituals whose meaning can only be elucidated by reference to their history? Second, what exactly is perceived when we perceive the inner nature of the practice? How do we perceive it? This question is especially vexing given attention in Wittgenstein's remarks. On the one hand, we perceive something that is objectively part of the facts pertaining to the practice. Is this evident in Wittgenstein's talk of the inner nature of the modern practice itself, as well as in his talk of internal relations and formal connections in connection with the ellipse circle analogy. On the other hand, Wittgenstein goes to great lengths to emphasize a subjective component. For example, he argues that whatever connections one discerns between the components of the practice in question, the account would not be complete without that which brings this picture into connection with our own feelings and thoughts, and gives the account its depth. Hunter says it's like theory versus application or intent versus effect. Yeah, I think that's right. We're separating out these things at the moment. And the author's just taking some time. I don't find this this is not like a deep paragraph, but like what they're doing is they're just laying the groundwork to separate this stuff out. So I think you got what's going on here. This tension is even more striking if we focus on the explanation for the sinister nature of a ritual such as Beltane Festival. While according to the end of the block quote above, the sinister quality lies in the character of the people who take part in the practices themselves. Wittgenstein also argues that it is we who ascribe it from our own experiences. In particular, he asks, how is it that in general human sacrifice is so deep and sinister? For is it only the suffering of the victim that makes this impression on us? He answers that this cannot be the case, since there are illnesses of all kinds which are connected with just as much suffering. Nevertheless, they do not call for this impression. No, the deep and the sinister do not become apparent merely by our coming to know the history of the external action. Rather, it is we who ascribe them from an inner experience. Therefore, the second question I posed above can be reformulated as follows. How should we reconcile the fact that the meaning of a given ritual is both dependent on and independent of spectators? Yeah, so this is the thing. Like, they want to get this, this is the question. Dependent and independent of the viewpoint. Now, it's going to be dependent on the spectators to recognize what the people are doing. Like, it's the people who pull the trigger, not the gun itself. It's the people who do human sacrifice, not the fire itself. There's nothing wrong with fire. But the people who light the fire under someone else, that's sinister. But like, again, it's independent of the spectators that someone's dying, but it's dependent on someone to recognize the aspect that you are doing something to someone else that you find bad. These questions bear on the workings of a surveyable representation of rituals. On the face of it, a surveyable representation of rituals has both positive and negative dimensions that parallel in part Wittgenstein's philosophical methodology. Alright, so now there was waxing poetic about what Wittgenstein's up to. On the positive side, this representation helps us attain greater clarity and understanding by seeing the inner nature of a ritual. On the negative side, the representation clears away misunderstanding insofar as it shows that we are confused in trying to advance the causal hypothetical explanations about the ritual's inner nature. However, a closer inspection leads to the following worries. If we endorse the bird's eye view model, then a surveyable representation of rituals might be understood as providing a sort of stamp album, as Marguerite puts it, in the sense that the ritual ceremonies should be interpreted as the stamps in an album, enabling the collector to clarify similarities and differences. However, as Clack argues, thus understood, it is far from obvious that Wittgenstein's framework of surveyable representation differs substantially from Fraser's approach, for once stripped of its theories, the Golden Bow is itself akin to a stamp album of rituals, grouping ceremonies thematically and enabling readers to survey similarities and differences. For example, Fraser concludes his discussion of the Beltane Festival by discussing fire festivals in Sweden and Bohemia. If we endorse the neglected aspects model, then, as Clack notes, we might want to say that certain aspects of rituals are neglected in Fraser's account, and so Wittgenstein's methodology is aimed at dispelling any confusion that is the result of this neglect by bringing a ritual into connection with pertinent phenomena. So we've got phenomena now. One could argue that the subjective dimension of the account, which pertains to our feelings and thoughts, constitutes the phenomenon in question. So this is how we think about it. So this is the observer view. Indeed, apart from the aforementioned examples, Wittgenstein notes the similarity between burning an effigy and our practice of kissing the picture of one's beloved. And more generally, when the phenomena of interest is brought into connection with an instinct which I myself possess, this is precisely the explanation wished for. Yeah, so like if you are like kissing a picture of someone you like, then what are you doing? Well, there's an emotional connection there. Otherwise, you're, kissing plastic or whatever photos are making of, like kissing your screen, kissing glass. Presumably, this thought leads Clack to conclude that this second alternative entails that fieldwork and empirical inquiry are not needed when considering rituals, which makes the risk of misunderstanding great, since focusing on our own behavior tells us little about the motivations and expectations of those engaged in the ritual. Put differently, according to the first alternative, the anthropologist was already more or less doing what Wittgenstein claims she ought to do, while according to the second alternative, there is not much for the anthropologist to do. Yeah, so basically, if on one side you're just, listing rituals among things that people do, and on the other hand, if you just look at it, you can just sort of, well, what are they up to? Then you're just describing what are the people doing. There's not much for the anthropologist to do there either. But you need to find something in so on one side it's just listing, and on the other side it's just intuiting. And so there's not much to be done in either case. Hunter says, so Ludwig is trying to add back the human element because it is relevant and meaningful, even if it is neglected in practice. I think so. I think that's what he's doing. Wittgenstein was, I think that's right. What was he up to? Is he was trying to get back what are the actual meaningful human interactions in some sense. He was worried, what was he worried about? Like when he was younger, he had tried to reduce everything to just sort of formal language in the Tractatus. When he got older, this is the investigations, he talked about language games, and so it was much more interested in practice. And like, why are we engaged in such practices? Which the first alternative is just listing the practices. But then in the second alternative, it's like saying, well, we're intuiting the practices. No, it's in this back and forth in the language game. What is going on in our gameplay? Again, the game metaphor from earlier. So it's the human element is like, why are we playing these games? Like, what is relevant and meaningful in these language games, or in this case, ritual. Okay, from aesthetics to aspect perception. I believe that an examination of Wittgenstein's views on aesthetics and aspect perception can shed light on the aforementioned questions. The comparison between rituals and aesthetics is warranted given analogies that Wittgenstein himself made. In addition to my remarks in the introduction, Moore records that when Wittgenstein discussed Fraser's Golden Bow, he said in connection with the Beltane Festival that this case you can observe the same thing being puzzling as in an aesthetic question. You ask, why does this thing impress us so much? Moreover, while he does not use the term surveyable representation in connection with his discussion of aesthetics, Wittgenstein does mention a resemblance between a philosophical investigation and one in aesthetics, in both of which an answer to a puzzle is to make a synopsis possible. Indeed, Wittgenstein's remarks on aesthetics resemble those on Fraser's Golden Bow and those on his philosophical methodology, and thus there is good reason to assume that we are entitled to talk of a surveyable representation in aesthetics. In particular, in several lectures and conversations, he argues against the idea of a science of aesthetics and clarifies that aesthetics is not a branch of psychology and has nothing to do with psychological experiments. This is so because while in psychology we are interested in causal connections, the aesthetic puzzle we feel when asked what makes something beautiful is not removed by providing causal hypothetical explanations about, for example, mechanisms in the brain or general psychological laws. More generally, Wittgenstein claims that in aesthetics one should reject any form of explanation, hypothesis, or theory. Rather, aesthetics is descriptive in nature. Oh dear, the sun's getting lower. I may have to go get a hat in a minute, because it's daytime. I don't normally stream during the day, and like I may get light right in my face because the sun comes down this way. Okay, but yeah, so what is this descriptive? What is aesthetic description? Is this how it makes you feel? Because that's not an explanation, hypothesis, or theory. Like what is part of the yeah, you can see like right here on my face, that's sunlight. So if that gets here, it's gonna be in my eyes. So, okay. Yeah, hold on. I'll be right back, okay? haven't had to do this in a while. I forgot about this. I need to keep a hat here. Alright, whatever. Let's keep going. We'll see where it gets. Hunter says, yeah, and the human element isn't to blame, but it is a fundamental condition for something taking place. So how can something not necessarily have responsibility while being essential? Yeah, so this is where we're getting. I mean, the history of the human element matters. But again, like, why do people keep doing it? So it's not necessary to have, like, how can something not necessarily have responsibility? Like the ritual, like, where is that? But, like, it's essential that there's people there. Like, who takes the responsibility for what we've been doing in rituals? That's a hard question, actually. Like, the institutions that support them? Or is it, the people actually doing it? It's like, you can ask all these questions about, like, you know, we've had lots of difficulty with religions nowadays doing, like, covering up, scandals. And so it's like the rituals that allowed this to happen, like the systems of protection that people exploited to abuse other people. It's like, this is the question, like, who gets the responsibility here? And that's a good point. All right. But again, like, where's the responsibility in aesthetics? Like, if you make people feel a certain way, is there a responsibility there? It's also a good question. Okay. Aesthetic descriptions involve certain comparisons, grouping together of certain cases, for example, by an arrangement of certain musical figures, comparing their effect on us, which allows us to solve aesthetic puzzlements. Thus, by showing a person a lot of pieces by artist X and drawing her attention to certain features, including pertinent comparisons between artist X and artist Y. In this passage, Wittgenstein discusses the example of Brahms and comparing Brahms to Keller, she sees the aesthetic solution. To tell a person this is the climax is like saying this is the man in the puzzle picture. Our attention is drawn to a certain feature, and from that point forward we see that feature. Wittgenstein calls the descriptions in question reasons and describes them as a form of justification. Aesthetic reasons are not subjective interpretations of a work of art. They are not about giving a given spectator's subjective impressions or her feelings of agreeableness or satisfaction, but rather aid us in perceiving the meaning of a work of art, in understanding what it all means, much in the same way that we hear a word as having this meaning. Okay, so we're still getting trouble here, though, because, like, if you want to explain a piece of art, you still might explain not why it's agreeable or satisfactory to you, but you're still explaining what it means to you in sense of why it has power. Like, what is the grip that a piece of art has on you? If you can see the power of the relation between the people, like if we do like a George Bellows, like a boxing thing. Let me show George Bellows real fast. So, like, something like this. So there's a George Bellows, what's it called? I forget. But, like, you can see. So, like, if you're looking at a piece of art like this, I can say, hey, look, there's figures there. But, like, what's it? Aesthetics is the means by which we understand and communicate with art. Aesthetics is just the study of, like, the meaning in art, I guess you could say. It's a philosophical, like, the philosophy of art is basically aesthetics, although people may have made a distinction there. But, like, if we take a look at this, like, this boxing match from George Bellows, like, you can see the, like, I don't know if you can see my mouse on screen, but, like, you can see this guy down here commentating and looking, you can see all this stuff, but, like, I can point out features, and then you can see why, like, this stuff, like the colors, and, like, how, like, the ref is there at, like, this angle, and, like, these guys are, like, in their faces and things like that. So it's like you can see that there's a like, you can see the brush strokes I can point out. Now, I can describe all this stuff, but none of that actually, like, the history there doesn't matter. You're describing the man in the puzzle picture. You can describe these things, but, like, why does that picture have, like, this, like, excitement of a boxing match? You can describe all these things. So it's not really the subjective impressions or feelings or agreeableness or satisfaction, but, like, how you understand the artwork, that it has, like, the motion and power that it does, and that's what it all means. And so it's not really how I like it. It's that it shows, like, I can describe things to show the interconnected relations in that artwork, to give you a meaning, to give that artwork its value in expressing the what it is like to have a exciting boxing match. So that sort of thing. Yeah, aesthetics, I mean, is technically a new word. It didn't really get coined until I think the late 1800s, and so like art for art's sake, for aesthetic good, is a rather new thought, and yeah, so that's basically what it is. So you can look it up. There's aesthetics. You can just like search for it, and there you'll find like Wikipedia pages, Stanford Encyclopedia pages, things like that. But you're going to find various definitions, but the full philosophy of art and what makes it valuable. All right, continuing. Wittgenstein's mention of internal relations in connection with the ellipse circle analogy in his remarks on Fraser resonate with the use of this term in his discussion of aspect perception. Oh, you were asking in terms of Ludwig's words here? Yeah, I don't know exactly what he was up to. The best we can do is like see how he's using it at this time, and basically this is what I think the author is trying to get Wittgenstein to say. This is what we're getting here at the moment is the author's Wittgenstein. So as like there's people used to call it Kripke's view of Wittgenstein. We're getting an author's take on this. This is not a view of This is not like this is not like just studying all Wittgenstein's uses of the word aesthetic. This is just what the author is picking and choosing to show us Wittgenstein, how he used aesthetic. So that's what we're getting here. All right, so I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, we're close at least. Wittgenstein's mention of internal relations in connection with the ellipse circle analogy in his remarks on Fraser resonate with the use of this term in his discussion of aspect perception. However, it is his discussion of aesthetics that makes for an even more compelling comparison to aspect perception. First, Wittgenstein notes that aspect perception's resemblance to conversation on aesthetic matters, where we tend to say, you have to see it like this is how it is meant. Indeed, in his discussion of aspect perception, he once again uses the example of suddenly seeing the solution of puzzle picture. Second, when arguing that aesthetics does not pertain to agreeableness, Wittgenstein provides the following example. That a sorrowful face becomes more sorrowful as the mouth turns downward is not a statement of psychology. I mean, how we perceive it is psychology. That it does this thing is a matter of human history, that this is how people are. That is that we frown when we're unhappy. And so that's that's the point, is that yes, it's psychology, but this is more about people being people. This is what we see sorrowful as. If we understand this claim as one about noticing a relation between two faces, the sorrowful and the more sorrowful face, we will appreciate that it is reminiscent of the following claim. I observe a face, then suddenly notice its likeness to another. I see that it has not changed, and yet I see it differently. I call this experience noticing an aspect. Okay, and so if you look at the phenomenology literature too, it's like you notice something in a certain way. It becomes apparent to your awareness, and so now it's like you saw the face, but then you saw it in a certain way. Is aspect seeing, sometimes it's called, this is from Wittgenstein, and it's like, but like yes, all of a sudden it hits you differently. It has a different phenomenology to it. The comparison to aspect perception is illuminating because of the nature of this type of perception. When we perceive certain things in their relevant aspects, we are not asking ourselves what are the causes, and what produces this impression, since our problem is not a causal but a conceptual one. And that's one of the reasons I have my duck rabbit as an emote. So you can say, look, it looks like a duck, it looks like a rabbit. Nothing on the page has changed. Nothing in chat has changed. Now it's a duck, now it's a rabbit. The experience of seeing an aspect is not an interpretation of what is seen. For to interpret is to think, to do something. Seeing it is a state. You see it as a duck, and then you see it as a rabbit. Perhaps there's something that goes on in between, but the seeing itself is just sort of static. Okay, and B, when we interpret, we form hypotheses which may prove false. Yeah, it's like if I'm trying to think of it, like to see it in a certain way, well, is this like kind of rabbit-like? Well, that could be wrong, but you can still see it as a rabbit or a duck. Interpretation would be required in the case of knowledge of an aspect and of knowing what a picture is supposed to represent. For example, when someone treats the picture as a working drawing, reads it like a blueprint. But reading a picture like a blueprint and so having knowledge of an aspect is generally not our attitude towards a picture. Rather, we immediately see the picture in a particular way. We view the picture on our wall as the very object, the man, the landscape, and so on, represented in it. For example, we see a man with a mustache in a portrait and do not just read off of it information about the visual appearance of the man, such as the fact that he has a mustache. As Gilead Bar Eli puts it, we see the pictures as a picture of so-and-so, not just interpret or know it or regard it to be so. We see the so-and-so in the picture. Aspect perception is an experience. We experience a comparison in the sense of seeing, hearing this and a variant of that, but one in which we perceive, to return to my initial point, an internal relation between the object of interest and other objects, thereby appreciating features of the object of interest. Yeah, and this is an old point in phenomenology, like pre-Wittgenstein. When you see something like, phone, okay, or like I'm wearing a hat, you don't see the aspects of the hat, you see a hat. Like, this is a thing. And so you see the thing as, like, you see the phone as a phone, you see a hat as a hat. You do not, like, oh, I see a brim and I see a cap, and oh yeah, that would make that a baseball style cap. Like, that's not how we do things. We see the hat, and then we can, like, think about it afterwards. Just as you can see the duck or you see the rabbit, but then thinking about it, you can switch, but, like, that's not the primary experience. Time is it? Okay. If we return to Wittgenstein's remark on Fraser, we will appreciate that what is at stake is not knowledge about what the ritual is supposed to represent, which would be an act of interpretation that may require causal hypothetical explanations about the ritual's origins. Rather than reading the ritual like a blueprint, we are to see the ritual as the very object represented in it, thus perceiving the ritual's meaning, which leaves an impression on us akin to seeing the solution in a work of art. This is the reason that Wittgenstein writes that the impression that a practice has on us is not due to a hypothesis about its origin, but rather arises from the material which is placed before our eyes and which leads to this hypothesis. Hunter says, it's almost like he's saying that aesthetics has nothing to do with the agreeableness or liking something, just the ability to see things critically so that you understand the significance of parts of the art. Like in a comic book panel, when the angle is low or high, it can signify a power dynamic, but if you've never learned to appreciate, be aware of that artistic representation, then it's all subjective. Yeah, I think you've got it. That's the thing. Of course, there is beauty in art, but that's not what Wittgenstein is talking about here. He wouldn't deny there was beauty in art, but like he's saying, but to appreciate things in art this is how we do it, and this has nothing to do with the beauty. Nothing. Like, this is how we appreciate the art, but beauty is something separate from this appreciation of art. And so that's what, I think, see, you're using aesthetics in this way now. So other people might use it to talk about beauty, but what Wittgenstein is talking about, appreciation versus enjoying. And you can appreciate ugly art. Like, there can be really ugly things in art, but you can appreciate it, and that's clearly separate from beauty. It's like you may say that's a disgusting piece of art, but at least it's interesting art because it has certain relations that it's trying to bring out. And that is what, is being discussed here, because, again, rituals are not traditionally thought as beautiful, but we can use the same sort of view about what is appreciable in the ritual that makes it an interesting ritual about bringing something out about human life, human practice. And I think that's the point here. These observations have the following upshot. One might think that the answer to the question of why Wittgenstein insists that knowledge of the origins of a practice is irrelevant to appreciating its meaning is methodological in nature. Explaining aesthetic phenomena by formulating causal hypotheses about people's likes and dislikes reduces the phenomena of interest, namely the aesthetic meaning and the reasons for seeing them, to something else. Likewise... Let's finish this up, then we can discuss. Likewise, explaining certain rituals by formulating causal hypotheses about the origins of these rituals reduces the phenomena of interest, namely the meanings of the practices and reasons for seeing them, to something else. So if, yeah, it's like, what are we doing? Why does it have meaning to us? Again, that doesn't really matter. Why does it have meaning to us now? Why does an art piece have meaning to us now? It doesn't always have to go back to what the artist was up to back in the day. Same thing. As what the ritual means to us now doesn't have to necessarily relate to what people were thinking of back in the day. They may have latched onto something bigger than what the actual origin was. In other words, one methodology is needed for understanding the ritual's origin, that's the causal hypothetical explanation, and a different methodology is needed for ascertaining its meaning, which is the surveyable representation. However, a mere appeal to two different methodologies might seem an arbitrary and uninformative distinction, especially if anthropologists already more or less do what the bird's eye view model of a surveyable representation asks them. The discussion above suggests that Wittgenstein had another reason, epistemological in nature, for downplaying the role of causal hypothetical explanation about the ritual's origin. In particular, there are two distinct epistemic states that one can inhabit in regards to the practice: knowledge about what the ritual is supposed to represent, which includes the ritual's origins, and seeing the ritual as the very objects represented in it, which includes the ritual's meaning in its present form. Therefore, there is no reason to reject the claim that the meaning of most rituals is to be elucidated by reference to their origins if this claim pertains to knowledge of what the practice is supposed to represent. In this sense, Mass does not have a meaning independently of how the practice was developed. However, Wittgenstein is not discussing our knowledge of such a meaning, but a direct representation of meanings from the material available to us. We see the practice in a value-laden way, rather than apprehend pieces of information about the practice that happen to include the fact that the practice has a meaning, or a historical meaning in this case. Yeah, and so which might require a causal hypothetical explanation in terms of its origins. See, yeah, I kind of disagree with how this last sentence was written. Then they should have moved this, I'm pointing at it like this. They should have moved that parenthetical in front of the meaning, which has a causal hypothetical explanation meaning. So it's like, it was just bad. I think this is just one time it's a badly formed sentence in terms of getting the punch out of here. But yeah, the meaning to us is separate from what people thought the meaning was back in the day. Now, that meaning may carry over, but not necessarily. It is important to emphasize that there is nothing odd or mysterious about the meanings that constitute an inner nature of a practice, which brings us to the second aforementioned question about Wittgenstein's understanding of rituals. In particular, the inner nature of a practice, its meaning or meanings, is not a product of the practice when considered independently of our own psychological reactions. Accordingly, one can perceive the ritual's inner nature only if one is in possession of certain sensibilities that partially constitute the value-laden features in question and that make one susceptible to recognizing them. Yeah, you have to actually understand what the things are in the ritual. If you think a duck is actually a rabbit, you're going to be confused when the duck is doing rabbit things. Similarly, if you're looking at a ritual and you don't understand what the players are doing in the ritual, then you're going to misinterpret it. Now, these aren't psychological things. You have to just understand what the thing is. It has to hit you in the right way to see a duck and not a rabbit. If you had a duck rabbit doing stuff. But that's not psychological. It's not a psychological reaction to stuff. This is talking about how you actually understand what is going on in a scene. If you are completely misunderstanding the characters in a painting, then you're not going to understand. There may still be great things about the painting, but you're going to miss at least part of the meaning there. Hunter says, it's like he expanded the philosophy of communication from linguistics to all modes of communication. Yeah, this is one of the things about Wittgenstein. That's absolutely right. He's always talking about language at the same time when he's talking about all sorts of things. And so it's not just linguistics. He's talking about all forms of interactions in games. And so everything to him was in sort of a language game, a logic game, if you will. And so it's all this is all tied together. And so you can't separate that out. The communicative aspect of it, the game playing aspect, because especially this stuff is tied into the investigations, and so we're talking about language games here, a lot of it, and so all the stuff is communicative. Hunter says, so we're seeing aesthetics as kind of art linguistics and ritual as social linguistics. Yeah, I mean, that's just Wittgenstein. That's a gloss of Wittgenstein, you could say, that sort of stuff, and that's kind of what's going on at this point. there's the really just bad take. If you want to describe Wittgenstein to people, you just say he's a behavioral linguist or a linguistic behaviorist. And so you look at the behaviors, in this case art or ritual, so social, but you just look at the behaviors and you're trying to understand the behaviors in a logical way. And that's kind of, you can always describe him that way. It's not a very good philosophical way to understand him, but if you need a shorthand, like this is a way to do it. But yeah. So everything's language and you have to read the language off the behavior in some sense. These sensibilities are not limited to a certain culture or era. Rather, they are possessed by those people who share a certain form of life. Like, how do you recognize what it is? You have to understand it in yourself that they are doing something similar to you. You have a certain form of life. You understand that, like, hammering for you is the same as hammering for them. Someone who's never hammered before does not share that form of life. So they don't understand hammering at that point. Therefore, one should see the Beltane Festival through the thoughts of man and his past, through all the strange things one sees and has seen and heard about in oneself and others. Yeah. They include, quote, a man's shadow which looks like him, his mirror image, the rain, thunderstorms, the phases of the moon, the changing of the seasons, the way in which animals are similar to and different from one another and in relation to man, the phenomena of death, birth, and sexual life, in short, everything we observe around us year in and year out, interconnected in so many different ways which play a part in his thinking, his philosophy, and his practices, or in precisely what we really know and find interesting. So it's green books, yeah. So that's Wittgenstein. However, since we also see the inner nature of the modern practice itself, Wittgenstein's conceptualization of the nature of rituals offer a middle ground between understanding rituals in Humean empiricist terms and understanding them in Platonic realist terms. On the one hand, the inner nature of the festival is not a mere projection on our part onto a meaningless practice. On the other hand, there are no self-standing sources of significance that exist in the practice independently of our response to the responses of participants in the practice. All right, so to make this a little simpler, we participate in forms of life. Forms of life turned out to be a big concept for late Wittgenstein. It's like we have these practices and we can map the things we are doing now onto like those are the things that we have meaning in, and so the forms that we see in the world in some sense relate back onto our form of life, and everyone who participates in our form of life, which for other people is basically everyone else to some degree. And so we can understand other people always to some degree because we all have to do similar things. We all have to eat, we all have hands more or less, but like it's like we all have to drink, like we all have these interactions we have to do. And so it's not Platonic realism because it's not out in the world, it has to do with our form of life, and it's not Humean empiricist because it's not just we discover these, because they already are parts of us. But yeah, it's like it is, I think, a little bit more of getting to some of the difficult parts of Wittgenstein that are less discussed. And Juliet Floyd made a big deal about forms of life recently. So Hunter says word usage is not dependent on etymology, but the word is dependent on etymology. Yeah, well, it's another thing you could say. The word usage is dependent on history, and the history comes all the way up into today. It's like it's not like the ancient history matters. It depends on how we are using it now. But like that's exactly right. So the word has a history, but how we are using it has to do with like current practice. But like that current practice is not exactly. It's not like this second. It goes back into the past, and that's right. Okay. Rather than being either entirely constituted by our psychological reactions or entirely dissociated from them, the value-laden phenomena in question are embedded in the normative existence of human life. This is the form of life that we are in, of meanings that are part and parcel of the tapestry of life in general and our being ceremonial animal. Of our being a ceremonial animal. Again, this is all just a form of life talk. What it is to be a human, the tapestry of a human life, a ceremonial animal. Again, what it is to have the form of our life is to perform certain kinds of ceremonies. I mean, and these don't have to be like religious. It could just be like, coming of age ceremonies is one thing, but eating together regularly is another kind of ceremony or ritual we do. Okay. And what role does a surveyable representation play? The preferred interpretation should be, I believe, the neglected aspects model, in the sense that the proposed methodology is intended to dispel confusion by bringing a ritual into connection with pertinent phenomena, but with an important clarification. The subjective dimension, which pertains to our feelings and thoughts, cannot constitute the phenomena in question in their entirety, nor indeed should these phenomena be reduced to mere psychological reactions. Rather, perceiving internal relations and formal connections is crucial. While seeing the inner nature of a practice is an experience, it is an experience of seeing internal relations and formal connections between the practice and other practices and aspects of human life, so that certain features of the practice are thereby exhibited. Yeah, so I mean, it's one of these things, like say you pray, and you don't have to pray in the sense of religious, you could you do something every morning, it's like your morning ritual. Why do you do this? Well, does it start your day off better? Why does that start your day off better? You can understand that, and you can understand people doing something similar to you that isn't your morning ritual, it's their morning ritual, but you can understand that they start their day off better by doing that every morning, and it gets them ready for their day. And you could say, well, look, then that is something similar to, a religious prayer that might get people in the right mindset for how they want to interact with the world. And so these sorts of things. Yeah. Okay. Conclusion. The point is, it connects to the sort of things we are and why they have meaning for us, and they're not psychological. It's that everyone does them because it gets you into that mindset. Now, is there a psychological aspect to it? Yes, but that doesn't matter. The matter is that this is like a ritual is descriptive, and that's what this surveyable representation is, that this ritual, the surveyable representation, relates to how we interact with our world. Okay, conclusion. What should the anthropologist do? I've argued that a surveyable representation of certain broadly construed anthropological facts allow us to see internal relations and formal connections, so that the inner nature of a ritual is exhibited in much the same way that such a representation of aesthetic facts allow us to see the solution of an aesthetic puzzle. This form of seeing, which is taken from Wittgenstein's discussion of aspect perception, both explains Wittgenstein's insistence that knowledge of the origins of a practice is not relevant to appreciating its inner nature, and clarifies what is perceived when we perceive this inner nature. Whatever the extent of Wittgenstein's true interest in anthropology, and while my aim in this paper has been primarily interpretive, I wish to conclude by noting the upshots of this discussion for anthropology, above and beyond the correction of misrepresentation of Wittgenstein's positions by anthropologists. The anthropologist has a double role to play. First, she must consider fieldwork in order to collect the relevant data and make pertinent comparisons between ritual of interest and other rituals. After all, who is better suited than the anthropologist to make these comparisons, in the same way that the musicologist or perhaps an ethnomusicologist would be most relevant person to make comparison between different pieces by Brahms, between Brahms and Keller, to use Wittgenstein's example. In this regard, if we understand the neglected aspects model along the lines suggested above, according to which the relevant comparison class is not merely our feelings and thoughts, there is no reason to assume, as Clack does, that comparisons are the result of fieldwork, that the comparisons that are the result of fieldwork ought to be ruled out. Second, the anthropologist should aim to perceive the relations and connections between these various rituals, thus seeing a ritual as having this meaning, to paraphrase Wittgenstein. In this regard, she needs to develop an ability akin to a musical ear, as Wittgenstein puts it when discussing aspect perception. Using her imagination is crucial in this regard. The concept of an aspect is related to the concept of imagination. In other words, the concept "now I see it as" is related to "now I am imagining that." Doesn't it take imagination to hear something as a variation on a particular theme? And yet one does perceive something in so hearing it. Consider, in conclusion, the example discussed among other places in Winch of some indigenous Australians carrying a stick or stone that is treated as if it embodies the soul of its carrier. If it is lost, the carrier anoints himself as the dead are anointed. Winch argues that it is not hard to see the sense in this practice if we remember that a lover in our society may carry about a picture of their beloved, which may symbolize for him their relationship. When the lover loses the picture, he may feel guilty and ask the beloved for forgiveness, like the person who anoints himself when he loses his soul. If the anthropologist sees these internal relations between the two rituals and other related rituals which will require fieldwork, she will understand, per Wittgenstein, what it all means. Okay, Yeah, very nice. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Wittgenstein quite often, so I like this stuff. This is why, like I said, I have my duck rabbit. If you want to just discuss these things, I have the ready made emote to go right there. So it's like, if you want to understand what is a duck and a rabbit, you have to actually have seen a duck and a rabbit before, or else you're not going to understand the duck rabbit. You might have, if say you have only ever seen a duck, then you won't be able, you might see a duck there, but you won't be able to see the rabbit. And so this is the thing, you have to do the anthropological work to see that, oh, there is also another animal that looks like this that could be in the duck rabbit. So it's like, if you haven't done that, you have to at least have that organized in your head. But then the switching is a different thing to see the duck and the rabbit, and that's how you get the connections. Hunter says, right, everything we imagine is necessarily constructed from our perception. Yeah, and that's what's going on here. You have to be able to have seen the world, and that's part of the anthropological categorization, but then you have to be able to see things in the right way, which is different. That's having this musical ear that Wittgenstein says, seeing the ritual as having a certain meaning, and the only way to understand that is to actually understand that there isn't, not just seeing a picture of a duck, but understanding that as an animal, a duck. Yeah, as the world, as its elements, but also related to the world. And that's why at the beginning they were talking about the structure and the form, that there are necessary connections. And so you have to understand how a duck and a rabbit exist sort of in the similar space of animals, and that they are related. Hunter says one would be able to connect history if it was nothing more than data points. Yeah. So it's like, if there was all just data points, you could do it, but you have to understand the world as elements, the things that yeah, I got you, Hunter. You wouldn't be able to connect it. It's that once you have to see it as the right kind of elements in order to make the right kind of connections to understand why things have meaning. And so why can we understand ritual? Because the idea that we do things because they have meaning to us, like people keep their heads covered all the time, and then if they lose their hat when they're outside, they feel bad. And it's like why you keep your lover's locket of hair or something, and because it represents something to the people, but it has to do with our practice. That's a ritual. Again, the Aborigine losing their stick, that represents their soul. The Indigenous Australians, again, it's to someone just looking, you can compare it to other people with sticks, but that doesn't matter. You have to see what it means to the people, and that has nothing to do with the history. It has to do with what the people are believing it to mean at the time. Hunter says, well, it's especially salient when we as a society deem certain practices immoral, and that was commonplace in the past. Oh, absolutely. And this is the question of how you interpret your rituals and what's meaning. Hunter says you can't judge the past by forcing your understanding onto it. You must understand the past. Yeah, and that's the thing. We a lot of times give the people in the past oh, they were terrible people, and many of them were terrible people. And it's well, you have to separate that out. You have to say in the context, they may have been much less terrible than everyone else at the time. People give Darwin some crap by saying that women were canny and that's they were sneaky. But at the time, people didn't think women had rationality, and so the fact that he was giving women any rationality at the time was a forward-thinking thing on him. So if you want to call him, say, a misogynist or anti-woman now, it's yes. Did he say some things like that? Sure. But was compared to the other people at the time, he may have been a bit more forward-thinking. But this is the thing. You have to look at what's going on in the society at the time and what people are trying to do. How bad was life really? Well, no, I know. I didn't think... this is just... I like the Darwin example because... It's very not clear what was going on in the 1800s sometimes when we're talking about rationality. Yeah, if you view slavery as an example, sometimes slavery's always been bad. There's nothing good about it, but there's still been better people and worse people, and you have to be able to understand what's going on in the society at the time. It's yeah, the ancient Greeks, they had slaves. And they thought of everyone who wasn't Greek as less than human, and they didn't think women could really understand whatever. So it's if you go back to Aristotle, there's a lot of trouble if you're trying to reconcile the old ancient Greeks with modern day thought. It's everything's terrible, but what were they doing? How are they trying to make their society better? There's still a lot of value in understanding that, and then when you understand how the different pieces kind of work together in their society, then you're in a better position to judge. Hunter says, was there ever a nation pre-enlightenment or pre-industrial revolution that conquered and didn't take slaves? I am not a historian. I wouldn't know. But yeah, probably not. Yeah, this is one of those things. Yeah, I'd be surprised too, but like that doesn't make it good. It just means that that's what happened in the past, and we're hopefully doing better now. I don't know, but like, yeah, but like this is the thing. Given ancient practices, we can't we can't just stomp on them. Like, they didn't have the technology we have now to automate a lot of our lives. Now, there's still terrible things that are happening right now. But again, like, we're in a society, we have to try to understand these things, and that's kind of like, what are our rituals now? What are they doing for us? Like, we have slavery in the past. What was it doing for them, and how did they justify it? They weren't stupid in ancient Greece, clearly not. Did some people probably argue against slavery? I'm sure some people did, but like, could their society function without it? Maybe not, and so it would have been like the downfall of ancient Greece, and they wouldn't, like, people living in ancient Greece aren't going to allow that. They weren't racist either. The ancient Greeks were racist. I mean, a lot of people were racist. That's not in question. But like, some people were. Some people are, and some people are less racist. The Greeks definitely. They were otherists. I mean, sure. But like, again, that's putting our modern term of racism on the ancient world. Of course, that's not exactly going to fit. But I mean, otherists is sort of it's semantics at that point. You feel like it was all derived from tribal us versus tribal them, not versus based on skin color. Yeah, I mean, of course, like, it was more complicated in the ancient world. But like, yeah, boy, did they hate the other peoples. Yeah. So it's like, yeah, was it race-based based on contemporary race theory? No. Was it they disliked everyone who wasn't Greek? And the answer is yes. That's fair. But I mean, does that fall along pretty similar lines? It's going to fall, I think, on pretty similar lines. So. No, didn't fall on the similar lines. I'm wrong. I'm not a historian. I'm not good. Absolutely not. But I mean, I thought they hated non-Greeks. Like, the Greeks thought other people were, like, civilized all of a sudden? Really? I'm happy to be wrong about this. Because, I mean, again, putting modern terms on the ancient world is very hard. But, like, that doesn't mean they didn't have slaves. They hated their slaves. They took over they took over the other Greeks, of course. They enslaved other Greeks. That's not even in question. That's, like, history. But, like, did they hate people on modern race terms? No. But did they hate everyone who wasn't, like, a rich white Greek person? Probably. Hey, George Bellows. So, let's see. This is, what is this called? What is this thing called? Blanking on the name. Stagit Sharkies. Yeah, so, 1909. Okay, fun paper.